said that Tuesday was the saddest day of my political life, and it was, and that wasn't for personal reasons. It wasn't because I had just ceased to be Chief Minister in Northern Ireland. It was because I am convinced that the policies and the institutions in which we were involved were the institutions that were right for Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. And my heritage as an Ulsterman, and the heritage that my young family want, is a heritage within the United Kingdom with fairness for all. And I think an awful lot of that ebbed away last Tuesday.
Was the fall of the executive the price that had to be paid for the ending of the strike?
In the end, it certainly was, no doubt about that.
There was no alternative?
I couldn't see it, because the other alternative was just to allow Northern Ireland to be paralysed, to allow people to die. And it seemed to me that the determination of the men operating this strike was such that that would have happened, because literally within hours of midday on Tuesday, if the strike had continued, you'd have had sewage running up and down the streets in Belfast, and you'd have had much worse things happening in hospitals and so on. And as responsible people, we were not prepared to allow that to happen. Any price was to be paid rather than have that happen.
And yet the Ulster Workers' Council and the loyalist politicians would probably argue that what they have achieved without a shot being fired and without a bomb being planted.
They've achieved more from that point of view in 10 days than the IRA succeeded in achieving with bombs and bullets and murder over a 5-year period. And in my view, they have certainly succeeded in weakening Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom in that 10-day period in the way that the IRA didn't manage to do over 5 years.
Have they done the provisionals work for them?
Absolutely no doubt about that. Of course they have.
From the beginning, the loyalist politicians, Mr. Craig, Mr. Paisley and Mr. West, have vowed to bring the executive down. Is it they who have brought the executive down?
I don't think so. I don't think they're their own masters. I'm quite convinced that it's the people, whoever they are, who organised this strike and who operated this strike that have succeeded. And it's become perfectly clear during the strike, in my view at least, that the politicians, Mr. Craig, Mr. Paisley and Mr. West, were simply coming along on the coattails of these people who were organising the strike. And it was the people that organised it that did the work, very effective work.
Do you accept that the strikers do represent the way that perhaps the majority of working class Protestants, certainly in Belfast, feel because of the support they had?
No. I believe that the support that became so apparent for this strike and that escalated so much towards the end of last week and then through last weekend, I believe that that was support for the feeling that, oh, we in Ulster have been kicked around for 5 years. We've suffered 1,000 deaths, we've been bombed, we've been assassinated, and we are going to show that we won't take any more of it. And this is our way of showing Britain, showing Dublin, that we've had enough.
What was your reaction to the Prime Minister's broadcast last Saturday?
Well, it was a broadcast that seemed to me to be directed entirely to English, Scottish and Welsh people. And I would have to say that psychologically it was very damaging in Northern Ireland eyes. People don't like to be called spongers. We're not spongers in Northern Ireland. We pay our taxes as part and parcel of the United Kingdom. So I think the net result was to harden support for the strike rather than to take support away from it.
Do you think that Mr. Wilson's broadcast played a part in the downfall of your executive?
To the extent that it hardened support for the strike, I'd have to say yes to that. I recognise that Mr. Wilson was speaking primarily from the point of view of people living in Britain, but on that occasion he ought to have been appealing to the people of Northern Ireland.
That seems to me to be a cardinal error, doesn't it?
I thought so.
Did you have any idea what the Prime Minister was going to say?
No. The Prime Minister, of course, makes his own speeches and is entitled to do so.
Do you think that the British government has been inflexible in the way in which it's handled events this week?
Well, I think that when I suggested to the Secretary of State on Tuesday that he should seek the services of, for instance, Sir Frederick Calderwood, a well-known Ulsterman who's an industrialist in Britain, or Lord Grey, the former governor of Northern Ireland, who would come over here and not negotiate as such, but would seek the views and the attitudes of all sides in this dispute, including the British government and our executive and the strikers, and then present that to the public. I thought that they were being too inflexible in not accepting that situation. I can understand their refusal to negotiate with the strikers. I shared their views on it.
If the British government had not been that inflexible, do you think that today you may still have been in power?
Well, I think if they had been prepared to bring some person like that onto the scene, this would have shown the general public that there was a willingness to find a way out of the strike. Because I think the unfortunate impression had got across that the British government wasn't prepared to find a way out of it. I think if that had been apparent to the public, that it would have taken a lot of the heat out of the situation, yes.
The basis on which the British government has conducted itself during this strike has been to maintain the executive, and yet the executive is now gone. Doesn't that mean that the British government's policy has failed?
I suppose you could say that all our policies have failed, those of us who believe in power sharing, because the power sharing executive has come down. I don't believe it has failed, though, for all time, because I believe it's the right policy, and I believe that right policies will get support.
Politicians like yourself have been talking now for 2 years about rallying the moderate support in Northern Ireland, and so far we haven't seen that support. Why do you think that we should see it now?
Well, sometimes a catastrophe is necessary to bring people up with a jolt. We've certainly had the catastrophe. I forecast that they will be brought up with the jolt. You see, I believe that there is widespread and growing support in Northern Ireland for the sort of things that we were trying to achieve in the power-sharing coalition government. But we didn't have a chance to get the work off the ground. We'd only been in office for 5 weeks when in Britain a general election was called, and the people who had been hammering hard against what we were trying to do had trump cards handed to them in going to that election and in inspiring fear in people which we had no opportunity to counter because we didn't have the time or the opportunity to do so.
How did you react when you learnt that Mr. Heath had decided to go to the country?
I was aghast. I told Francis Pym, who was the Northern Ireland Secretary of State at the time, that this was tragic so far as Northern Ireland was concerned, and from the first day that there was a rumour of an early election, I conveyed this to him, and I believe it was conveyed to Mr. Heath.
What did Mr. Heath say, do you know?
I don't know. I assume that he had his own mind to make up about when the election would be held.
Do you think that the British government, or the Conservative government as it was at the time, regarded Northern Ireland and its political future as a sufficiently great priority?
No, I don't believe they did. I don't want to be unfair to anybody, but I believe that anyone would accept now that there is nothing of greater importance to the United Kingdom than restoring authority for democracy in Northern Ireland. It was just as important in January of this year as it is now, and it's tragic that that wasn't recognised at that time.
If there had not been a general election earlier this year, would there still have been an executive? Would there still have been Sunningdale?
Not only would there still be an executive, but there would be very widespread support for it, in my view. And yes, we would have had the opportunity to show the values of the things that were agreed at Sunningdale. In that context, I have always maintained that the prospect of some kind of formal relationship between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic is much more frightening to people than power sharing. And so it has proved the Council of Ireland, the thought of the Council of Ireland, which was a body to be equally representative of Dublin ministers and Belfast ministers, is much more worrying and seen as much more of a threat to their constitution by people in Northern Ireland than power sharing. Nevertheless, I am quite convinced that there is no threat to the constitution either of Northern Ireland or of the Republic in anything that was proposed at Sunningdale. In particular, I thought that the agreements that were reached at Sunningdale to cooperate between Belfast and Dublin, between North and South, on dealing with terrorism on an all-Ireland basis, these were the most important developments in Irish history over the last 50 years. But the developments didn't come quickly enough after the Sunningdale Agreement. There wasn't the evidence of the ground, on the ground, of the real and overt cooperation between the civic guards, that's the police force in the south, and the police force in Northern Ireland, or between the Irish army from the south and the British army in the north. If there'd been the evidence of overt cooperation between those security forces, this would have done more to produce confidence in Northern Ireland than anything else, and would have made a success of the Sunningdale proposals.
I think you probably accept that a great many working class Protestants in Belfast had severe reservations, to put it mildly, about what you were trying to do. How hard...
I think they had severe reservations about this specific Council of Ireland proposal, because they felt that that in some way was selling them out to an Irish Republic.
How hard then did you yourself try to re-educate the Protestant working class of Belfast?
I don't think I ever tried harder in my political life to convince people of the wisdom of what we were doing than I did on these matters. But we were greatly hindered on this business of the Council of Ireland because as a result of Sunningdale, there was to be further negotiation between Dublin and Belfast on the form that the Council of Ireland should take. And my colleagues and I in the Unionist Party tried very hard to persuade our partners in the executive and the members of the Dublin government to agree weeks and weeks and weeks ago to finalise the proposals for the Council of Ireland, to let people see what they were. We didn't succeed in getting agreement to that finalisation until just Wednesday of last week.
If you had been able to publish the modification of Sunningdale before the strike had begun, do you think that the strike would have been avoided?
I'm convinced it would have been avoided. There would have been no strike in those circumstances.
So why couldn't you do it?
Because, as I've just said, we couldn't persuade our partners to reach final agreement on this any earlier. And I accept, of course, that they had political problems as we had political problems. But I think it's very regrettable that we couldn't persuade them.
Do you not fear that the support that you may have had amongst MPs at Westminster may now begin to evaporate, and that what people now begin to say is that the only solution is to let the Irish sort it out themselves, that we should withdraw?
Well, I can see that there's a temptation for people to see that, to say that. Particularly there's a temptation in the minds of people whose sons are serving in the army over here, whose husbands, whose boyfriends are serving in the army over here. There's a temptation for them to say that. I don't believe that responsible opinion in Britain, and in particular opinion in Parliament, is prepared to allow a situation to develop, which would develop if troops were withdrawn, which would be a very terrible civil war situation indeed. I would admit, though, that because the people of Northern Ireland would appear not to be willing to operate the proposals which the Westminster Parliament, which is our Parliament as much as a Scotsman's Parliament, appear not to be prepared to put those into operation, that this damages Northern Ireland and tempts people in Britain to say enough's enough.
Realistically, do you fear that the movement to withdraw, to disengage, may, as a result of what has happened this week, now grow?
Well, I don't know. I can't say whether it will. Only time will tell. But I can tell you this. I would be prepared to exert myself to the last ounce of energy that I possessed to persuade the people of the rest of the United Kingdom that Northern Ireland deserved support, and likewise to persuade the people of Northern Ireland that they had to deserve that support by their actions.
What if the rest of the United Kingdom decides that Northern Ireland has had every reasonable chance that the United Kingdom should be prepared to give it?
I'd still be prepared to go to the United Kingdom and argue very strongly for them having second thoughts if they came to that conclusion.
Isn't the significance of what has happened this week that real power has passed from elected politicians like yourself and from the British government at Westminster to the people who run the streets in Belfast, and the British government has been powerless to prevent it?
Well, perhaps it's a good thing if that has been brought out in public and people see it. Perhaps it's a good thing from the whole United Kingdom point of view, because what has happened could as easily happen in any British city on your side of the Irish Sea as on our side of the Irish Sea. It's something that I think we've got to guard against in future and perhaps take some kind of measures against.
And also something that you have to take seriously.
Indeed, on a United Kingdom basis.
What is there to stop the people who have brought about the strike over the past 2 weeks doing exactly the same again in a few months' time or a few years' time if they don't get what they want?
It's a lesson that has got to be observed and to be acted upon. I think that what has happened in Northern Ireland over this last 2 weeks has been the most important political warning that Western Europe has had since 1945.
But you and the British government have been powerless to prevent it.
We can take lessons for the future, though, can't we?